Hello, welcome to day 2 of the ICC Sustainability Conference, International Trade and Prosperity Week. We will be making the start shortly. We're letting people get onto the Zoom call, and so we're seeing the numbers go up slowly. Before we make a start, we just wanted to say thank you to some of our sponsors who have supported us over the 3-day conference. That's including ESG 360, Halion, and also Diageo, who hosted yesterday's in-person day. We had a very busy session yesterday. We had about 150 people join us. We've had about 650 people register over the course of 3 days, an international audience. So this is definitely a global conference, and it's going to be recorded and distributed through our ICC network to all of the ICC partners and country partners that have helped us put this together. Something else that we wanted to bring to everyone's attention is that yesterday we launched our toolkit, our sustainability toolkit, which contains some excellent insights from business, from industry, and guidance on focusing on some of the sustainability and environmental topics that we've covered as part of these 3 days. So I do encourage you to use the QR code and download it. We'll also put it into the chat room as well, so that you've got access. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our moderator, Chris Southworth, who is Secretary General of ICC in the United Kingdom. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Nat, and welcome to this session. Plastic pollution, a very topical issue. We spent quite a bit of time yesterday talking about this topic and some of the challenges and opportunities. So today we've got a chance to go into this in a bit more detail. I've got a fantastic panel here. So if I can ask my panel to all come on screen. And then in no particular order, I'm just going to ask each person just to very quickly introduce who they are and why plastics is important to them. If I can start with you, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Altmann-Richer. I'm Senior Vice President for Global Communications and Regulation at Polymateria. We're a scale-up business who are making a new standard in biodegradable and recyclable plastics. Plastic's important to us because this is a major global environmental issue, and I will get into it, but I'd emphasize the point global, that innovation is absolutely key in order to be able to tackle this challenge, given the variety of approaches that are going to be needed. So looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Chris.
Lauren.
Hi. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me and organizing this very relevant session. I would say indeed a very timely moment. So I'm Llorenç, Milà, Canals. I lead the Secretariat of the Life Cycle Initiative, which is within the United Nations Environment Programme based in Paris. And why plastic is important to me? Well, maybe to be a bit provocative, it's perhaps a great extreme and visible example of what a linear economy is and a very inefficient use of resources. So I also see it as a very good opportunity to do things better, and then perhaps also to expand this better way of doing things to other sectors in the economy.
Thank you very much. Louise?
Yes, hi, I'm Louise Smith. I'm the Environmental Policy Lead at the LEGO Group. And why does the LEGO Group care about plastic? We obviously make one of the most famous plastic products in the world, which is a fantastic product that's used over and over again, but it means we really need we've got a lot of sustainability ambition, and we really need to see change in the plastic value chain in the coming years. So it's something that's very, very important to us.
Lego has to be the most recyclable toy, doesn't it? I've still got it from when I was a kid and passed it on as well. So great to have you with us. Rory.
Thanks, Chris. Rory Cronin. I'm responsible for packaging policy at Unilever. We are a large consumer goods company. We have about 400 brands, operate across 190 markets. About 3.5 billion consumers use our products every day. We like to think that makes us the world's most global company. As for why plastics is important for me, I think whether you work in this field or not, it's a tangible topic area that's going to impact all of us, whether we know it or whether we like it or not. And I think we already have the levers at our disposal to reduce and ultimately eliminate pollution. We just need to make sure everyone knows they exist and everyone starts pulling on those levers. So glad to be here. Looking forward to the debate.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, everybody. Great to have you with us. So let's just dive in. Those in the audience, please do ask questions. Sometimes the most important part of this is the Q&A. So don't sit quiet. Do put your questions into the Q&A space, and we'll pick those up and keep an eye on them. So if I can just dive in, Llorenç, if I can just come back to you. I mean, what is the scale of the problem we're talking about here when we're facing plastic pollution?
Okay, so maybe some of they are beginning to be quite well-known statistics, but humans produce about 430 million metric tons of new plastic every year. Well, actually, this grows every year, but that's kind of the latest number we have. And this seems to be set to triple by 2060. So that's a lot of plastic, and the systems that we have to manage it are really not coping. So according to a UNEP study that we had in 2021, between 19 and 23 million metric tons of plastic enters and damages aquatic ecosystems every year. We also see through research that under business as usual, plastic could get to emit 19%, almost 20% of the global greenhouse gas emissions that would be allowed under a 1.5 degree scenario by 2040. We already see that this 1.5 degree scenario is, escaping very, very quickly. But of course, we cannot allow this growth of emissions in any sector. And of course, there's also many negative effects on ecosystems, definitely wildlife. We've seen on climate, human health as well, and the economy. So in the latest report by UNEP that is called the Turning Off the Tap, that's kind of the background you see here. We published this earlier this year, and we're bringing together studies that quantify the costs that are associated with the impacts on environment related to plastic pollution, also to chemicals related to plastics. And it's not just the impacts on the environment, but also the costs related to human health that are linked to the exposure to these chemicals. And we see that the externality costs, these externalities, are of the same order of magnitude as the total turnover of the plastics industry. So kind of in terms of the scale, I think that's already pretty big, and hopefully that sets the context.
That's really certainly focuses the mind, doesn't it? Some of those numbers are quite alarming. I think we've all seen pictures of plastic floating around the Pacific Ocean and seen it on beaches and all the other things. I think it's very much in people's minds. Stephen, I mean, what differences of approach are you seeing in different parts of the world? Ultimately, we need global solutions here, don't we?
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Chris, and fully agree with Llorenç's points. I think the challenge with plastic pollution is there's no silver bullet solution. We need to reduce, we need to reuse, we need to recycle. Absolutely. We also need to take innovative approaches. So if you look at the challenge that's different in different markets. So if you take Western Europe and the US, under 5% of plastic sort of leaks into the environment directly. So actually, let's say the Western world is pretty good at collecting the plastic. We're not particularly good at recycling it, but we're very good at collecting the plastic, and therefore, you can see where to focus the solutions. If you go to places like Southeast Asia, India, parts of Latin America, you see a totally different ecosystem. So let's take a country like Malaysia, for example, somewhere where we're doing quite a bit of work. 63% of plastic in Malaysia, this is the Malaysian government's figure, simply leaks into the environment. And when you're sitting in the UK or Western Europe, it's quite hard to fathom that. That means if you have a plastic cup in Malaysia, let's say, it is more likely than not to end up in the environment. And 80% of plastic in the ocean comes from plastic that's originally, let's say, polluted onto the land. So, in places like that, as well as obviously reducing the overall amount of plastic, huge amounts of investment in infrastructure that is required, we also need innovative solutions to tackle the problem as it exists now, as the big background says, to turn off that tap, not just in terms of plastic being created, but also plastic to stop it on land before it reaches the ocean. So that there's going to be different solutions that are required in different places in terms of how the problem presents itself.
So it needs a sort of segmented approach. So that's interesting. Llorenç, if I can just come back to you, and then I'm going to go to Rory and Louise. What's the price of the plastic challenge? I mean, how do we get to a place where the pricing mechanism for virgin, this came up yesterday actually, virgin plastic versus recycled is on par, or at least incentivizing recycling and reuse?
Yeah, that's a very good one. And so as mentioned earlier, and that's maybe one common consideration that many people have, is that plastic is cheap. But actually, plastic, and particularly virgin plastic, is not cheap. And linked to the point before, so I didn't give the number, but the price tag, if you want, the price tag of the externalities linked to plastic, we estimated in UNEP that is between $300 and $600 billion per year. That's a very conservative estimate. It's quite likely to be higher than that. And just for comparison, the turnover that I mentioned before, the turnover, kind of the product of the plastics industry, is between 600 and 700 billion per year. So we're really at the same order of magnitude. And when it comes to the problem that we often see, that virgin plastic seems cheaper, or is sold at a cheaper price than recycled plastic. In this Turning Off the Tap report, we outline how can governments change the rules of the game. The problem is that the rules of the game are not even, they are not fair, and we need to bring these full costs of pollution closer, or bring them into the price of plastic. We could, one possibility is to perhaps charge a levy on plastic producers to contribute as well to financing the collection, the sorting, and the recycling infrastructure. So what they are putting in the market can actually be absorbed also by the infrastructure at the end of life. But it's not just about financing. We can also bring in the right incentives so the plastics are designed to be more recyclable. Stephen was mentioning as well some of that. If you're designing the polymers, perhaps with simplified, less number of different polymers, reducing the number of different additives, the different chemicals that we're putting, and particularly eliminating the most hazardous of these chemicals, we can already make plastics much more recyclable. We can also make them, using less layers, using less complexity. All of these actions and many more can enhance the economics of recycling. But maybe also let me just chip in here that the most important element to remember is that recycling is also the last step in the circular economy. We need to bring forward the waste hierarchy. We need to enforce this waste hierarchy, starting with reduce the size of the problem, then promote much more models for reuse the plastic products within the economy, and then as the last step, obviously ensure the recycling.
And when you say it's not fair, can you just explain what you mean by that?
Well, it's always the issue about externalities and the free riders, right? So you're putting in the market, you're putting a product that actually generates lots of costs, but you leave these costs for society to bear. So society has to pay the cost of health impacts related to plastics. We need to pay the costs of cleaning up the environment with the plastic that gets there, or the cost of reduced environmental services, ecosystem services linked to plastic pollution. All these costs are left for society to pay, while the plastic producers are just enjoying the benefits of selling it at a price that does not represent its cost. I hope that clarifies the fairness thing.
That's very, very clear. So, okay, all important questions to Rory and Louise. Let's go Louise first, Rory second. As manufacturers, what sort of challenges do you have with your global supply chains? What sort of barriers are you facing in moving to I was going to say plastics free, but or less plastics, or more reusable plastics, however you want to phrase that?
Sure, yes. Well, obviously from the Lego Group perspective, the product from its inception has been designed to be reused, to be modular, to be durable. And many people on this call will have, passed Lego to their children, to their grandchildren. It is this long-lasting product, and it's kind of, it has these circular elements from its inception. But a huge challenge is how to make that into a working economic model, because we know that the product goes out into the world, and we know that it's reused in a multi-generational way. And we have lots of pilots, which I can come back to, but we're in the middle of the plastic value chain. We're right in the middle. We don't contribute super heavily to pollution. I'd never say we don't contribute at all, because some of those pieces are tiny, but we're not a heavy contributor. But still, it means getting it back, finding a way to make it circular is currently very challenging. And there isn't a great policy landscape that helps us to make it economically viable and make the business case. We want to do it, Lego's a family-owned company with a huge ambition to improve circularity, but we've been looking into it for years and it is extremely challenging to do.
Yeah, I think when it comes to Lego, shouldn't we just ban anyone who throws away? Shouldn't that be a crime, I think?
Exactly.
Lego away.
Perfect.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. Got another Lego fan, I noticed in the chat room, Jonathan Harris there. Rory, what are your views?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, similarly to the comments already made, I mean, at Unilever, as mentioned by Stephen, we do follow the hierarchy, the waste hierarchy in our packaging decisions. So that's reduction first, reuse, recycle. When it comes to reduction, we've reduced our virgin footprint by 13% by 2019 baseline. And that's been driven by design choices, internal strategy, we call it less, better, no plastic. So that involves moving away from plastic entirely. So, for example, our famous pot noodle food product in the UK is now sold in paper pots. Includes lightweighting, so reducing the packaging, the amount of plastic packaging we do use. New models such as reuse and refill, and increasing our recycled content percentages, which now stands at over 21%. And I would absolutely echo the comments made about the price disparity between recycled content, or PCR as we call it in the jargon, versus virgin. PCR is at an extreme premium, which makes the long-term business case to increase PCR quite challenging, but we're fully committed to it. On reuse, I mean, that is a challenge for us. We've done a significant number of pilots around the world. Some more successful than others. One at the moment in Indonesia, we've got about 400 refill outlets, which are based at waste banks, primarily for home care. But look, the challenge of reuse is also the significant opportunity, and it's not just about new designs, right? This is about new infrastructure, entirely new business models, and I think collaboration here is absolutely key. The value chain has to move at one, whether that's the retailers or the end user. It cannot be done in isolation because you just will not get the scale. And I think the plastic treaty, which we negotiated next week, has a big role to play. And then finally, on this point of recycling, just to echo the challenges here. So our technical recyclability rate for packaging stands at about 71%. The actual recyclability rate is lower than that, in the 50s. And that gap is to do with the collection, sorting, processing infrastructure. And the infrastructure hasn't met with the demand for recycling, and it hasn't met with the demand for PCR. And that for us is not just a pollution challenge. That is, that's a commercial challenge, because the more we want to get recycled content into our packaging, it just doesn't exist at the moment. Or if it does exist, it's low quantity, or it's just extremely expensive.
Yeah, big challenges there. Stephen, ICC have been a big advocate of commitments on ending plastic pollution. It's been a big conversation for a long time. So we're delighted at the commitment to end plastic pollution by 2024. That feels extremely challenging. But how do we bring SMEs along with us? I mean, this is sort of tied to the conversations around global supply chains.
Yeah, good question, Chris. I mean, it obviously depends on where the SMEs are in the value chain. So, there are a huge number of SMEs doing really exciting stuff on innovation to do with tackling this problem in the first place. So, I think SMEs have a key role to play in terms of developing the technologies that will help us, emerge from this situation. Obviously, Polymateria being one of those, but there's a huge number of, exciting technologies that are being developed. I think then in terms of, SMEs being part of the solution from a general perspective, I mean, I would have thought that SMEs at that point, act in a similar way to a consumer. That a lot of the challenge here is also, I mean, we focus a lot around, so far on sort of, what businesses are doing and, responsibilities, but also we have to empower consumers to take action. And I think, that would apply to SMEs as well. I think a lot of this, we talk about, sort of big infrastructure project development, we talk about, government policies, etc. There's a lot that is that can be in the hands of the consumer. And I think that can also be, very much applicable to an SME who, from the perspective of tackling the challenge, an SME would probably operate more like a consumer than like a, than like a huge business.
And it's sort of a similar question, really. Llorenç, if I can come to you, looking for global solutions, the number one issue that always comes up is this diversity between developed and developing economies, whether you call that north, south, east, or west. But I think we know what we're talking about here. I mean, the same thing. How do we do this in a way that works for everybody, in a way that we don't leave anyone behind? But we also meet those local needs. You name Malaysia, but there are lots of other countries who have far less capabilities in all sorts of policy areas, enforcement or policy more broadly. How do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's indeed a key challenge. I mean, huge diversity in conditions, but also, and similar to what Stephen was saying, I mean, different countries, if you want, maybe also in different positions in the value chain. I mean, all countries import plastics, but some export oil and gas. That is kind of the building block of plastic, and then some produce plastic and export it. Depending on the conditions of the country, socioeconomic, the capacity in terms of collecting waste. I mean, this is also an important one when we're talking about the waste collection, for instance. Only collecting waste, and we're now talking all waste. There's actually so much population that still lacks the basic access to waste collection and management. That indeed is a super challenge in itself. But the idea is that we need to have overarching goals, and we need to have kind of common and universal principles that work, like resource conservation and the waste hierarchy that I was mentioning before. I mean, don't get me wrong, when we're talking about plastics, I mean, I put it as perhaps a bit negative, but plastic is indeed a fantastic material. It provides such versatility, and it has great qualities, like being lightweighted and super durable and almost unbreakable. The thing is, the problem is we're using it for things that last very, very short time. So why do you use such a valuable and long-lasting material for something that is going to be used for 5 minutes? This is where we have to bring in these kind of common principles to then, use them to guide the action towards common goals, getting into the type of targets that we can agree together. And then, of course, different countries may work towards that shared ambition and approaches with locally adequate implementation actions. But in order to do that in value chains which are so international and so global, like the plastics value chain, we need quite a lot of things to be standardized. There are many aspects like, plastics composition and how do we share the information about this composition, what goes into the plastic, which is extremely valuable information when we come to reuse that plastic and actually recycle it at the end of life. How do we define the quality of plastic recyclates? So all of these elements can work more at a global level, and this is where we need more international agreement. And then different countries will indeed start with different actions depending on where they are in the area of plastic, and with more local action. I hope that kind of provides a bit of a lead there.
Yeah, and I'm going to put you on the spot now. Just a sort of secondary question is that we often talk about leapfrogging, where countries have big legacy systems. It is complex to transition from one way of doing things to another way of doing things, and often talks about when you talk about emerging markets where systems don't exist. Can you leapfrog into effectively a much more modern system without that long transition? Is that possible, or is that just not realistic in a small island economy or a smaller economy where there just isn't the capability to do anything else?
I mean, I think we definitely need that. And actually, also, I mean, I don't know, I think we have to make up a new word, and I don't know which one it will be, but, we say about leapfrogging, but, reuse systems are so much more resource efficient. And many times the problem is that we used to have reuse systems 50 years ago in the developed world. These systems are quite common in developing countries. the important thing there is to avoid that these systems become obsolete or are outcompeted unfairly by single-use products. So it's more than leapfrogging. Is, well, how can we maybe modernize these reuse systems, but ensuring that they are maintained there? And indeed, in many other occasions, it's about not going through the errors of that we've already had, like going through increased complexity, making products that are perhaps particularly in the packaging sector, which are amazing in terms of the properties, the functional properties that we're putting into this packaging, but we're making it completely unrecyclable, and we're making it, we're dissipating the resource in those packaging. So how can we ensure that we don't go through that same pathway and then have to go back into simpler solutions for packaging that, well, can be reused and can be also more easily recycled at the end of life? So yes, definitely we'll need leapfrogging, but sometimes as well, it's kind of, I don't know, leaping to stay in the same place of reuse where you already have these systems, ensure that we don't lose them.
Yeah, and I suppose the question for countries like the UK, what can we learn from other parts of the world? I mean, that sort of takes us to sort of international best practice. Louise, if I can come to you first and then Rory. Lego's famous, isn't it, as you said earlier, for being passed on through the generations. I mean, what do you do to ensure that does happen?
Well, I think the first thing is we have committed that no matter what material we end up using for Lego, any brick ever made will fit with any brick that's ever been made. And we're maintaining that because that means our legacy product will always fit with our continued product. And I think that's important for keeping it circular, and it's important for setting the groundwork for a more circular model in the future. It does mean finding new materials is harder, because we will not give up on that durability element and the fact that every brick made now will fit with every brick ever made. So that's, I think, the first thing, is that design, we're not letting it go because it's so important. The second thing is we are trialing circular business models around the world. So our most famous and well-known and successful one is in the US. We have a model called Replay. So anyone who's on the call in the US might know about this. And we had to create our own reverse logistics for it because they didn't exist, which is the challenge. But we encourage consumers to send back any old Lego bricks they're not using. We pay postage, we clean them up, we sort them out. And at the moment, because we wanted to learn from the model, it's a donation program. So we've donated just shy of 150,000 sets to charities around the US and schools. And that's all old used Lego bricks. And we've been doing that for about 3-4 years now. And it was entirely to understand, well, what are the reverse logistics needed? What will consumers send it? What will they send? They don't just send bricks. We've had microwaves in there. We've had a wig. So there isn't a real element of sorting that we have to take on. But it's been really successful, and it's been a way for us to also use those old bricks for our social programs, which is great, and to learn from it. We're currently looking at some smaller pilots in Europe, and we have one running right now. It's very small in Germany, where we are testing how much we pay customers to bring back their Lego bricks to our stores. So we're paying per kilo. Again, none of this is scalable right now, but we need this data. We need to understand what are the margins, how is it going to work? And we see it as us testing the market, so then we can go to policymakers and say, this is what we need, these are the tools we need. Because otherwise it's very difficult to say to policymakers, well, we need a better environment for circular business models, without saying this is what we've learned from putting the effort in ourselves. So I'm not sure any of our pilots right now, truthfully, will be scaled up to the level of our main Lego product, but they teach us an awful lot about what we need to create that in the future.
And that's an interesting point, that, isn't it? I mean, so you're learning at the moment, gathering data.
Yeah.
If I was to say to you in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, do you think you would be do you think there would be a sort of fully formed recycle program, in that sense that people are sending it back and then you're able to deal with that? We just
I think there could definitely be larger programs. Replay is pretty big. It's whether or not they can compete with the linear model commercially in 3 years would be my question. But I think we will continue to have the programs, absolutely, and they will grow and grow. We're not going to stop, because it's it's going to be a huge lever for us to pull for the future. But I wouldn't want to say it's definitely going to be able to compete commercially against selling new products at this point. In the long term, that's what I want to see.
Yeah, interesting. So Rory, Unilever are famous for international best practice. You mentioned pot noodles, which will make every student happy. What other successful projects could you name, and how do you advise both your supply chain, producers, manufacturers, and customers as well?
Great. I just want to come back on before I answer that point that Llorenç was making around this kind of the need for kind of global harmonization sort of delivered nationally, and I think that totally resonates certainly with Unilever. We're a member of what's called the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty, and we exist ultimately to reinforce that message. You know, we need an element of harmonization, global rules, so the fragmented policy landscape kind of comes together and every government is kind of pulling in the same direction, and that is absolutely essential to tackle the plastic pollution issue. But from a business point of view, you know, whether you're a domestic trader, you know, you're exporting to a couple of markets, or you're a business of our size, that legal certainty is going to inform, you know, your packaging choices forevermore. So it gives businesses clarity of where they need to go, what they can and can't use, etc. Stephen, you got your hand up. Is that to come in?
Sorry, Rory. Yeah, I just wanted to agree with you on this kind of global rules and sort of add in the point of standards. So you know, we're manufacturing a you know, an innovative approach, innovative materials, and I think standards are really important, not just you know, for companies like Unilever to have a kind of comprehensive approach, so you can use one type of packaging everywhere, which obviously is what is needed. But standards are also key for innovators. So you know, what innovators want to see from policymakers are you know, clear and ambitious standard set, but without too much direction on how those standards are achieved. So you know, setting the outcomes, the goals. So you know, if you look at that as a very high level, and you take the area that we work in biodegradable plastics, what you want is to have plastics that are fully biodegradable, no risk of any microplastics being left, and no risk of any environmental harm, so toxicity issues. If you can achieve those three aspects, then you have what would be, you know, probably considered to be a safe product. And then it's up to innovators to, you know, create the different approaches that can achieve that outcome. And that's the benefit of standards, not just to help you know, the likes of a Unilever have that kind of uniform product. They actually also really help innovators like us.
Perfect.
You preempted my. I was going to come back to you, Stephen, actually on exactly that. Rory, just carry on. So I'm curious, particularly with Unilever, because you've also got thousands of lines of products. I mean, when you talk about standardization and harmonization, how do you do that in a company like Unilever with such a vast range?
Yeah, I mean, it is a big job. The way we're structured is we've got what's called a center of excellence, which is a central team made up of 40 people, scientists, researchers, technicians. They're dedicated. You know, it's a big team dedicated to getting this right. And obviously, we have the luxury of having that kind of resource, given our scale. I'm not saying that's going to be appropriate for every business, but I guess the point is it's well resourced. And it's centrally driven, so we can kind of see the big trends, what standards are going to be coming down the track. How do we ensure that something we're selling in you know, one market is going to be permitted in another market? But to come back to your initial point in terms of you know, innovation and building on the pot noodle shout out, I think, you know, some of my favorite projects at Unilever have been where the packaging decision has not been packaging led. It's actually been led by changing the product, so what's inside the packaging. So moving laundry detergents away from capsules to sheets, to actually, you know, 1 or 2 millimeter biodegradable sheets that will go in your washing machine and not come back out. And that allows us to reduce the packaging entirely by about 80%. Also, to give a quick shout out to our Magnum ice cream team, who launched a recycled polypropylene tub in Europe, which was no mean feat given the challenges around accessing food grade PCR. So yeah, shout out to Magnum. And I guess come back into that point, I think it was Stephen mentioned about the role of consumers. So to give you an example of the innovation that didn't work for Unilever, it's not plastic related, but it's still packaging nonetheless. And this is when we launched a deodorant can, which was half the size of your regular deodorant can. We had to pull that from the market because the consumer perception was they were getting less value for money, despite having exactly the same content. So absolutely agree with Stephen. There is a huge role for the consumer to play in this journey.
Yeah, we might want to come back to that. So it's a really good point. That's interesting, isn't it? I suppose you think you get half as much, wouldn't you, if it's half the size? Llorenç, I'm going to come to a question. John Taylor's posed a couple of interesting questions. So I might come to the tax one to you, Louise and Rory, because I think coming from a corporate perspective, that might be quite interesting in that Q&A. So in the meantime, Llorenç, the new Plastics Economy Global Commitment Report, that's quite a long title, was just recently published, I think last week. What can we learn from that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And yeah, for those who might still don't know, the global commitment, that's how we call it for short, but the new Plastics Economy Global Commitment, this was launched 5 years ago by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and UNEP, and is the biggest, as we know, global voluntary effort to tackle plastic packaging waste and pollution. So this is quite focused on plastic packaging, and you know, just to be very clear as well, it's quite different when you're using plastic for durable things like the Lego bricks, or you know, when we use it in cars or buildings. Packaging is probably kind of the key culprit in terms of plastic pollution, and certainly a key area for innovation. So anyway, going back to the global commitment, it has in the latest report that indeed was published last week, it shows that it is possible to make meaningful progress to tackle plastic pollution. But it also shows that the world still remains significantly off track. We understand that we need many actions at the international level with an ambitious international legally binding instrument, and also with greater business action. So it's not just action from a regulatory perspective. We need also businesses to come in, of course, if we are to stop the flow of plastic pollution. We see, I mean, there are some very positive messages. So business signatories have, for instance, increased their use of recycled plastics by 1.5 million tons per year. So this is not just about recycling, it's actually using the recycled content. And this amount, 1.5 million tons per year of increased recycled plastic use, is equivalent to leaving 1 barrel of oil in the ground every 2 seconds. So every year, every 2 seconds, we're getting this oil left on the ground by using this amount of plastic. And that's huge. That's really big. However, we also see that these business signatories and the government signatories, despite the fact that they are actually outperforming the rest of the market, many of them will still miss some of the 2025 goals. And this is particularly true in areas that are a bit more difficult. So on the one hand, you know, using perhaps recycled material, if you have access to it, is relatively easy. You're not really changing your product. You're just using different materials. Of course, there are complications in it, but you can do it. Nobody really notices. But in other areas where perhaps we're talking about, you know, shifting to reuse, so scaling up reuse reuse schemes, this is much more complicated. You're really asking consumers to change their behaviors as well. So we need a more enabling regulatory framework. Otherwise, those who are kind of the front runners find themselves alone and competing, and often outcompeted by those that keep kind of the usual resource inefficient single-use systems. So in this context, the international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution that is being negotiated, and we're starting the 3rd session next week, it really is offering a once-in-a-generation opportunity to put the right legally binding measures in place at the international level, so we can really make progress and have the right incentives to tackle the global problem.
Yeah, let's just hold some of that thought, because we're going to come to innovation in a minute. But you know, as often the case with these big challenges, it requires some out of the box thinking, doesn't it? Especially around behaviours, as these problems often sometimes relate to. John's actually asked a couple of questions here. So I'm going to ask one to Louise and Rory, and then the second to Stephen on harmonisation, with both good questions. So if I can just go with tax. Tax is a difficult instrument sometimes, isn't it? It's easy to ask for it, and sometimes, you regret what you're asking for when governments start implementing it. What do you think about the use of tax? Can tax help us incentivize the right type of behavior?
Who wants to go? Shall I go?
Yeah, Louise, you go first. Yeah.
So yes, there are already some taxes on particularly single-use plastics, and a lot of them come in the form of extended producer responsibility schemes. There are specific plastic packaging taxes, like in the UK. I would say it's helped us. So one of the things I forgot to mention earlier is that any of you that buy Lego now probably will notice that there are quite a lot of small, clear insert bags made of plastic that you do have to throw straight in the bin inside the box with the bricks inside them. We will completely phase those out by 2025 and switch to paper. And some of the taxes that are already being implemented have been helpful for that business decision, because we've been able to say, well, we're currently having to pay this much tax for those single-use plastics items, and we won't have to once the new, they're going to be paper, completely recyclable paper bags come in. So that's a helpful thing for the internal push, certainly. What I would say about extended producer responsibility schemes is that they are not at all harmonized at the moment. They're applied very differently in different countries, in different regions. And what we would love to see as a global company, and I'm sure Rory will build on this as well, is that they are, we would love the legally binding instrument to drive some harmonization of EPRs, because it would really help us. And we would love the money that comes from those EPRs to go back into that incredibly necessary infrastructure challenge, because we know that it's a big ask to say, member states, we need you to improve infrastructure, but it does have to be done at that level. We can't, as the Lego group, solve it on our own. And that's where I think, plastic taxes could become, or the money from extended producer responsibility schemes could become a huge driver in the improvement of that infrastructure.
And just as quickly, I might ask Rory you the same question, is as you move away from one product onto another product, does that mean you're basically disintermediating some of your suppliers, or are they coming with you on that journey and recalibrating their own products?
It's a mix. Yeah, it is a mix. It's obviously quite a different product because it's fiber-based now and it was plastic-based. But we work with our suppliers a lot. I'm sure Unilever will do the same thing, but we have a program called Engage to Reduce, where we work very closely with suppliers on all aspects of that value chain. Because again, we realized a number of years ago, we're a big brand, we're not a huge company. We need to be using our influence in our value chain. And many of our suppliers are much more expert on some of these things than we are. We know toys, we know durable plastic toys. We don't necessarily know paper packaging as well as some of the providers of paper packaging. So we've really needed to lean on our suppliers for some of this and push for that innovation. And so yeah, it has to be a joint effort. It's not something we can do alone.
Actually, you've just reminded me of a good case study we had last year of driving innovation. This is more around net zero, but turning the challenge into a collective challenge across the global supply chain.
Yeah.
And then there was a case from Anglo American of actually building a whole hydrogen truck, the largest in the world, but they're not truck manufacturers, they're miners. But that was an example actually of kind of thinking outside the box and actually outside your comfort zone in order to then solve a challenge that you need to solve. So absolutely. Rory, if I can come to you, tax, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Would you support it? Obviously, and then your comments on this issue with taxes are quite often been implemented in different ways, which is always a more complex problem or creates.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. So there's tax on your packaging, which is ultimately a kind of upstream tax on the material, and then there's EPR, which is essentially extended producer responsibility, where producers fund and manage the costs of packaging waste once it enters the waste stream. So it's more of a downstream measure. I guess the tax is a relatively blunt instrument, and because it's a government set policy, the tax money will it will go to the exchequer, it will go to the finance department, and it's then into a pot, and there's no way of knowing whether that tax money is spent on recycling infrastructure or not. We had this debate over and over and over with some of the countries in Europe who went first with plastic taxes, and the message was we do not hypothecate tax money, so they couldn't guarantee that it was going to be invested in infrastructure, which is why as Unilever we advocate for this EPR model as a much better system, because it is guaranteeing a sustainable source of finance to fund the operational costs of waste management. So you're guaranteeing, the OPEX, and that is going to make the investment case for waste managers going into that market, much stronger, because it's almost guaranteed by the regulation. And what EPR also does, it not just adds transparency to the financial flows, it also adds transparency to the material flows. Because if these systems are operated by independent bodies that are regulated, they have to disclose performance metrics, et cetera, et cetera. So all of a sudden you can start to map, okay, so Unilever put on, X many tons of HDPE, it's gone into, this municipality collection system, which has sent it to this reprocessor, that's then sold it to that recycler, and then we can start to kind of build the circular economy because we have all of this data. So from a Unilever point of view, EPR would trump tax any day of the week.
That's interesting. So I'm just conscious of time. If anybody's got any questions, please do fire them in. We've got about 7 minutes, and then I'm going to hand over to Natalie to close the session. And we've got a couple of sections to go yet, innovation, collaboration. So Stephen, if I can ask you just for a quick answer, and then I'm going to shoot straight into innovation collaboration. But there's a good question there about harmonization. This is a topic that comes up across the ICC world all the time at the moment. Standardization, harmonization. The big question is who is organizing and convening that conversation? Is there a body? Does it need creating, or should we just be supporting what already exists?
Yeah, I mean, so from a standards perspective, you've got you've got ISO, the International Standards Organization, who in theory are amalgamating the different global standards that are created, or different national standards that are created, and coming out with the kind of global versions. I think the challenge with that system is that it's not particularly open to SMEs. So, the committees that create those standards tend to be, established approaches. It's not particularly open to SMEs. There are some new approaches that are being created to do that. So BSI, the British Standards Institution, for example, has a sort of route to standardization specifically designed for innovative technologies, which is fantastic. And I think we need more of that. And just on the second part of the question, Chris, around should it vary by sector? I believe it should, because I think standards need to be quite specific. If standards are too generic and high level, they don't really encourage the outcomes that you want to achieve. So from my perspective as an innovator, having standards that are specific and relevant to particular materials or particular sectors is the right way of kind of slicing up this problem of making sure you're getting the approaches coming forward which are going to solve this challenge across the different aspects, rather than a particularly blunt instrument. That the blunt instrument would be that kind of legally binding instrument we've seen that sets the ambition. In terms of how you achieve that ambition, the standards will need to be implemented across different aspects.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question to Rory and Louise on first mover advantages, disadvantages. That's a common question, and I'm going to come to all of you on these interlinkages between net zero, biodiversity, recycling, circular economy. It's just an endless list of sustainability jobs and tasks that we all have, especially with COP coming up. That's a very relevant conversation. There's a meeting in Kenya that Nairobi, you mentioned, Llorenç, but we've also got the WTO ministerial conference coming up, haven't we, in the new year? So Rory, Louise, what are the first mover advantages, disadvantages, and what would be your advice for companies who do have plastic products and you are thinking about moving away to either a more reusable, recyclable, or even less production for that matter? Maybe Rory will go to you first this time, and then Louise.
It's a great question. I think just to put it into some context first, and the EMF global commitment has already been mentioned. But that is, that's a group of businesses that make up about 20% of packaging placed on the market. That means there's 80% of the market is not playing by the same rules. So it gets to a point where actually the 20% can only do so much, and there is not a level playing field. And as I mentioned at the top of the call, it makes some of those bigger bets hard to place, because the industry, the market is not going to be there with you. And if you go it alone, there is the risk, in the case of the deodorant cans example, that it doesn't work. So I think there are increasingly more risks for being a first mover, which is why I think we need the need for kind of regulation to keep pace here, because it is that phrase, and it's a very kind of business lingo phrase, but it is about the level playing field. Because only when everyone knows that we're all playing by the same rules, I think you will see an acceleration for all in all of these new models, especially things like reuse. It will start to unlock very, very, very quickly. Louise, I don't know what you're thinking.
Well, just before we go to Louise, that's a great answer. So we talk about tipping points. What would you say? So you say 20% are playing by the rules, 80% are not, just for argument's sake. What would you say would be the percentage where we are at tipping point and the influence there, and then everybody follows? Is that 50% or is that less?
Oh, you put me on the spot there. It's a good question. I don't have the specific data, but I know that modeling has been done on reuse, for example. And if you hit 40% of one category goes into reuse, the research suggests that that is enough to make the difference. So it is a high threshold. It is a high threshold. It's not a great answer, but
no. I think it's a difficult question, right? But it's not always 50% though, is it? I mean, I think that's the point I always take away. It's if it's 40%, it's 40%. But I think in our minds, it's good to know that. It's because ultimately we want to get to tipping point as fast as we can, and then the market will drive it as the norm. And I think particularly from a policy point of view, I think it's good to think about, and then how do we get to tipping point rather than how do we solve the whole problem? Those are two different policy questions. What are your thoughts, Louise?
So I think, a big benefit, and I'm going to come to actually Jonathan's question here, is exactly as Rory says, it is really hard to do, and it doesn't always work. And we do need some goodwill from the public, from consumers, because we are trying things. Innovation is trying things that you don't definitely know will work. And I think there needs to be a bit more willingness in the world to trying and failing some of these innovations, because companies like the Lego Group and Unilever are doing that, and some of it's really successful and some of it's not. So coming to Jonathan's question, I think the benefit of being an innovator, the benefit of communicating your innovation is, if you are a company that is still having to use a lot of plastic, even if, like our product, it lasts a really long time, we know we have to use a lot of plastic. What we can demonstrate through that innovation to our consumers and to the world is that we really are trying. There is an awful lot of money, an awful lot of effort, and an awful lot of will coming from the Lego Group to innovate as much as possible, which is why Jonathan can still be happy with his Lego supercars, because it's a company that's really trying. And I think without that innovation, it would be harder to say, it's a fantastic product, keep on buying it. It's because we're doing those things. But the downside is exactly as Rory said, it's high risk, it doesn't always work. And you'll all have seen the headlines recently that we tried to make the product from recycled PET and that did not work. And there will probably be other things we'll try that might not work. And so I think there's an element of saying to businesses, work with others, don't try and do it on your own. And as a world, be willing for some of these innovations not to be the perfect solution. And I know, again, same for the Lego Group as for Unilever, we can afford to do that, which is harder for others. But I'd say that's where partnerships are so important, and not trying to do it on your own.
Yeah, there needs to be a bit of forgiveness from the consumer too, doesn't it? If you're trying to do the right thing but it hasn't quite worked out, it doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do, doesn't it? There must be goodwill when it comes to Lego, surely. Okay, so final question, and I'm going to hand back to Nafi because we're running on time. So this is, I'm going to go zip around the panel. This is a really good question on collaboration and just general join up in the ecosystem. So we've got plastic pollution, we've got net zero, we've got biodiversity, we've got trade, and to some degree they're all connected to each other. Do we need to solve all of them before we can solve plastic pollution, or can we solve plastic pollution while we're solving the other areas? And then, sorry, just join to that very quickly is, do we need to be more collaborative across the whole system, or is that too complex? Maybe, Llorenç, I'm going to go around my screen. Sorry if that's not in your order. Llorenç, I'll go with you first.
Thanks, Chris. So I think we can indeed, maybe you were doing that in at the last part of the question. I think it's really to turn it around. I think solving plastic pollution will help us solve the other challenges. Not in itself, of course, we need to do many other things, but actually plastic pollution being linked to all of these crises, it will, I mean, as we're sorting it, it will help us align the efforts. So in that, indeed, collaboration will be absolutely crucial. I mean, maybe I'm not in the best position of, being in an international organization, intergovernmental organization, but indeed, I think it needs a lot of collaboration, and there's a lot of parts in the value chain where this collaboration can happen. I mean, in a pretty competitive way as well, and I think we hear that all the time. So hopefully, I mean, that's a part of the message.
Right, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to work on solving it in parallel because we don't have time to do otherwise. I just pick out one aspect of the problem, which is the aspect I was talking about plastic, which is not being collected and ending up in nature. Globally, that's 32% of plastic. So less than 5% in some parts of the world, as high as 60 to 80% in other parts of the world. But that's an aspect of the problem we need to tackle now, because that's the part that is ending up in the oceans, which is the biggest part of this crisis. So I don't think we can afford not to. Okay, brilliant. Rory?
Missed the question. I was typing away to Ben on the chat, so forgive me, Chris. What was
the question? Should we plastic pollution, net zero, biodiversity, trade are all interconnected to some degree or other. Do we need to solve all the other problems before we solve plastic pollution, all the other way around? And do we need more collaboration than we already have across those different areas of work?
100% yes on the collaboration. I think you can solve for them at the same time. So if you solve plastic pollution, we're going to go some way to net zero and addressing biodiversity challenges. So for Unilever, plastic packaging accounts for 12% of our emissions. So that is a big chunk to address if we're going to hit our own net zero target. And if you read our climate transition action plan, which we're about to update in Q1, plastics is first and foremost as part of that strategy as well.
Fantastic. And Louise, very quickly, Nat's on the screen, which tells me we're out of time, but very, very quickly, what's your thought?
Yeah, absolutely. Collaboration is key, and much more than we've done in the past. As I was saying, we can't innovate. We've got to innovate across value chains now. We can't innovate on our own. And absolutely, we have to solve them all at once. They're completely interconnected. It's a system. They can't be separated. So yes, we have to work on all of it at once, unfortunately. But solving one problem will solve the others. And if we can solve them all a bit, then we'll have improvements in every area. So I think, yeah, no way we can wait.
Well, it's a positive note to finish on. Thank you so much to the panel. What a great discussion. Look forward to continuing the conversation. There's lots to do, isn't there? But thank you so much. Over to you, Nat.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Chris, for moderating. It's been a fantastic session, really insightful, and something that hopefully we can continue discussing in the future. Just as a reminder, all of these sessions are going to be made available on YouTube next week, so that we can then also have on-demand content for everyone that missed any of the sessions or on different time zones. So do watch out for an email that'll be coming through, notifying you of when they'll be available. Also, I've just put in the chat room a link to a very, very short survey. It's just to help us guide for 2024 content around our sustainability agenda. So please do take the time to complete that, because it's very, very helpful for us. As a reminder, 3 tomorrow. We've got 2 sessions, one at 10 o'clock UK time on green claims and consumer trust, and then also again at 12 PM UK time on human rights and climate change, and that will see us through to the end of the 3 days. Thanks again, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
I'll be in touch, Louise, for a Lego discount Christmas present.
Yeah, me too.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.